I'm going to finish today with the situation in Sydney this week with the young 20-year-old Mert Ney. I don't know if I'm saying that rightly, but he was listed by his family as a missing person after he vanished from the family home a few days ago in Western Sydney, and that was following an incident where he bashed and choked his sister. Disappeared. Details are still scant, but you would have seen it in the news that he stabbed to death a 24-year-old woman in a Clarence Street apartment building. She was a woman who was known to be a prostitute. He then took to the street and stabbed a 41-year-old woman in the back. She survived. She remains in St Vincent's Hospital recovering right now. Ney has suffered from a range of psychiatric conditions, it's emerged, pretty serious ones. He was also heard as he ran around the street with this bloodied knife that he was heard shouting Allahu Akbar and Allah will protect me and things like that, which indicate some Islamic influence perhaps. And Ney was chased, he was tackled to the ground, he was restrained with, and so some of you might have seen the pictures in the video, with a milk crate around his head and a chair around over his body, and 4 men who are identified as heroes were involved in that effort, which is Lee Cuthbert, Alex Roberts, Paul O'Shaughnessy and Luke O'Shaughnessy. Now, there is a debate taking place as to whether this guy was actually an Islamic extremist or if he was mental and he was shouting those things out because of his mental conditions. Look, I'm not usually sympathetic to the debates around, well, was it mental health or not? On this one, okay, let's have a look. He had serious mental problems. Was he really even Islamic? Well, happy to find out. Certainly, by his own word, he was influenced on that front. But the concern usually is that there's a refusal to acknowledge Islamic connection. I'm actually refreshed by the way in which the police are talking about this so openly. But there's very often a refusal to acknowledge a connection where it is really clear. And they refuse to do it, and they always go down the mental health road. And it is a problem, because I think we need to be alive to and alert to an issue, which is that these debates can obscure the reality that there is a very real connection between Islamism and terrorism. Nobody assumes that this guy's a disgruntled Presbyterian who's just been reading the Bible. No one assumes that it's another Pentecostal who's been radicalized at his local megachurch. No one assumes that it's a nun. But everyone asks the question, is it Islamist terrorism? Because there isn't a clear and consistently confirmed link between violence and Christianity. In fact, violent judgment is the sole purview, the sole discretion of God himself in the Christian scriptures. It is not something which we can take upon ourselves to do in our own rights, ever. There is limited grant of power to the state to execute justice in that way, but it is not granted to us as individual citizens. It is God's purview. God will judge, and he will judge on a coming day. Islam is different. It is. There's debate about how to interpret the scriptures, but certainly some of them interpret those Islamic scriptures that make direct appeals to violence very literally. But see, the difference is also seen in the fruit of that faith. Since September 11, Islamic terrorists have carried out more than 35,453 deadly terror attacks. That's a remarkable number. Mostly in the Middle East, yes. And in the week, just the 1 week from August the 3rd to August the 9th, there were 28 attacks, 118 people killed, 331 injured, 4 suicide blasts, and across 12 countries. Just 2 days ago in the Philippines, 3 were killed, 1 injured. A 2-year-old girl is among those killed by Abu Sayyaf gunmen. Also 2 days ago, Iraq, 2 killed, 2 injured, gunned down by Islamic State soldiers. 3 days ago, Nigeria, 2 killed, 1 injured. Boko Haram murdered 2 men and cut off the ears of 1 woman. I could go on every day, and many of them are in those Middle Eastern countries. But as you go through the list, you see that there's heaps that have spread to Europe. More than we realise, we forget actually, because the news reporting just cycles over. North America, Asia. There's a connection, and we cannot be fools about the connection. And it's a connection between a certain type of radical Islamist and violence. And it's a connection that we cannot conflate with a connection between religion and violence in general. It is true, and it needs to be said time and again, that there is this one kind of religion that is substantially different to others. But let me say this in closing. I could go into more detail on that on another episode and all of the information there. But I want to say something which is a good news point. and I like to finish on a high note. And I watched some of the mobile phone footage taken by onlookers of this guy. And I must say, there were really brave people involved. The news article mentioned 4 men, most of the news articles do. But if you watch those mobile phone videos and so on, you will see that for a substantial period of time, there was actually only 1 man. And I don't know which man it was, but he was armed with a chair. And he was taking it up to this guy who had blood all down his front. He had a knife that had clearly been used more than once. And he was swinging it around and he was behaving unpredictably. And this one bloke with a chair was clearly, had his wits about him and was trying very hard not to be hurt. But he was very brave. I mean, he was incredibly brave. And it's sometime later that you then see further video of the few guys that have tackled this fella to the ground. They've got a milk crate over his head so he can't move that, and they've got a body pinned with a chair, and they're desperately trying to avoid his flailing arms because they're worried that he might have weapons on him. And here's the point. Do you know, men of character are a good thing. In an age of toxic masculinity, in an age of effectively man-hating, in an age that says there's identity groups, and there's some identities that are bad by nature and that perpetuate violence, and one of those is men and all their terrible masculinity, well, I got to say this. I'm glad, and I think pretty much everyone in their right mind is glad, that yesterday there were men on the streets in Sydney. These guys who were strong, these guys who were full of testosterone, these guys who had an impulse to run into danger and not run away from danger. There is very little doubt that lives were saved because of the preventative efforts of these guys at potentially enormous cost to themselves. I did a vlog last year which said that a man's strength is to be found in his strength of character first, and that is what Christ calls us to. You see, again, if we deny the reality of people's character, if we deny the reality of the importance of moral formation, then all we're left with is the brute force of masculinity or whatever else defines an identity group. But when it is shaped, molded, submitted to the character of Jesus Christ, it is totally different. Christ calls us to take all that we have, strength and everything else, and use it with little thought for self, but rather to lay down our lives for the sake of others. That's Christianity. That is, in fact, a Christian legacy. I'm Mark Niles, and that was The Truth of It.